everyone, and welcome to our second BLAKitecture talk for the 2020-2021 season, or the year that must not be named and the year that brings hope for all. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I am currently sitting on my couch from my home. Welcome to my home. The Wurundjeri and the Boon Wurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I would also like to acknowledge that the elders and traditional custodians and families and genealogical lines of everyone that joins me here today, and pay my respects to their country and their family and their connections and their relationships. We are all gathered here today to have a bit of a conversation about the state of the Indigenous architecture conversation, and joining me in this yarn are some of the most deadly Aboriginal and Maori women that I know and have the privilege of having conversations with. And we're going to have a couple of reflect on, what is the Indigenous architecture conversation, where has it gone, where has it come from, and where's it going to next, and the conversations that we feel that need to happen at this point in time. So first thing I'd like to do is ask everyone to introduce themselves. And we'll go Carol, Georgia, Elizabeth, Jade, in order of people on my screen. And I'll hand over to Carol. Hello,
everyone. My name's Carol Gosam. I'm a Jidabal Gumbalbudda woman from North Queensland. I'm also a lecturer at the University of Queensland and teach research and architecture studios.
Hi everyone, I'm Georgia Burks. I'm a proud descendant of the Kamilaroi and Dungari people. I'm up here in Brisbane as an associate at Myers Elliott Architects in Paddington, and I'm also one of the co-curators for the Asia Pacific Architecture Festival.
Kia ora koutou katoa I tēnei pō. Nau mai hara mai ki tēnei kōrero. Te kaupapa nei, ai he mihi nunui ki ngā mana whenua mo tēnei rohe, mo tēnā rohe, ki ngā tini aitua mo tēnei rohe, mo tēnā rohe. Ai, kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Just a brief acknowledgement in the strange world that is currently conversations virtually. I suppose. I haven't quite got my head around how exactly you acknowledge everything here, there and everywhere, but nonetheless, kia ora. My name's Elizabeth Hinemoheta. E te taha I tōku tapa on my father's side, te uri ahau no Ngāti Wai me Waikato Tainui. I te taha o tōku mama on my mother's side, I'm from Samoa, Tokelau and England. I like to talk about being kind of straddling the Pacific, or having one foot kind of on one island and another here. So yes, may my ancestors greet yours, and thank you for joining us. I am a senior associate at the architectural firm in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland, called Jasmax. I run an internal rōpū or group called Wakamaya, and we fundamentally exist to support better built environment outcomes for Māori, but also for non-Māori, in an acknowledgement of their treaty relationship, treaty partnership duties within the context of Aotearoa, which I'm aware is a different thing in different countries. As well as that, I have tutored, I do tend to write, and I have recently come home just before lockdowns from Sydney, being an artist at the Sydney Biennale. So, ai, kia ora.
Tēnā koutou, ko Jake ki tōku ingoa. E te taha o tōku mama, he uri tēnei no Ngāpuhi te arawa te whakatohia, e tipu aku au e te rohe o te iwi Banjala, kei Parua hau e noho ana, ko au he kaihautu o te kaupapa o Matakohe. So kia ora everyone, my name is Jade. I actually did have some tātai or some links to Australia because I was born and raised on Bunjalung country, and then I went to university up in Brisbane at the University of Queensland for my undergrad. But I responded to the call to come home, so I've been home for 8 years now. And I've been steadily growing this kaupapa of Matoko here, which is a kaupapa Māori design studio based in Whangarei and Tiotaitukioro. And we solely exist to provide architectural and urban design and cultural design services to our whānau hapu iwi. Ngā Māori katoa, but I've been building a team and trying to draw everyone home actually. So all of our team of 5 are wahine Māori from Tiotaitukioro who really bring a wealth of skills and knowledge and community connectedness. And so it really does good things for our hapu to be able to have our own people working on our projects. So I'm very privileged to be in that position, and every day is exciting and work is really fun.
Thank you, everyone. For those who might not know me, I've been curating the BLAKitecture series for 4 years now. My name is Sarah Lynn Rees. I'm a Palawa woman descending from the Plangamarina Trawaway people of northeast Tasmania and convicts from the Cambridgeshire region in England. I'm very privileged to be able to hold these conversations, and a massive thank you to MPavilion for supporting this through funding and also through ongoing support in centering these kind of conversations in their program. So before we sort of get into the nitty gritty of the conversation, I guess I want to ask everyone, open question to all of you, by way a little bit of context, what made you first interested in getting into the built environment or architecture? So what drove you? What planted that seed in your mind that made you say, yeah, that's what I want to do? Maybe we'll start with Carol.
Yeah, sure. Well, it was wanting to change Indigenous housing, and at that time, I guess it was the Indigenous housing that I grew up in and was very familiar with was really government provided housing, and some of the designs were really quite brutal and horrible. And didn't really reflect the extended kin household that I grew up in. And so I could see family, when they were living in housing, adapting things to actually suit needs and modifying spaces. And I think I had very limited knowledge, obviously, when I was growing up, that this is what architects do. They actually design spaces places, and was a latecomer to a knowledge of even the profession of architecture existed, and so essentially it was probably a very late development that architecture could actually have a role in changing that. So that's essentially where I started from.
Mine is kind of simple, I guess. Like, I grew up in houses that were being renovated a lot. Mum and Dad constantly renovated, and Dad was in the built industry anyway as an electrician, and taught me how to read plans, which I thought was really interesting. And you know, I have this vivid memory of him asking me how I wanted to design my bunk bed, and it had all of these like curtains and verandas and stuff that you don't put on a bunk bed. But then I guess with the development at high school, I did a lot of art, and I also did a lot of graphic design, which was in the Man Arts building, and it all kind of just evolved from there. And I guess I was guided by school and by my parents into architecture. And then when I started learning architecture at university, I realized that there was so much more to a building than just walls and a roof. And I think that is what has kept me so invested in learning more about architecture and the way that it influences cultures and communities around the world.
Lovely. It's funny. I chuckle at this question now because I've been asked it a lot, but I love hearing other people's answers to it. I don't know whether it's strange or not anymore, but I have been to some extent thinking about architecture, though not knowing that that was the word for it, since I was probably about 5. I grew up in an incredibly small house you know, within a certain level of poverty, shall we say. And, you know, we lived in what was called a railway cottage, which was basically just a nice way of saying a really small shack for a single man to temporarily help build the railway in. As a family of 5, you know, kind of only fit one chair in the sitting room. And I remember astutely as a child how much of the arguments of my parents were around things that related to lack. I very quickly associated the notion of sort of a house and a home as contributing significantly to people's health, love, sort of sense of safety, and all those other things. There's lots of long stories associated to that, but effectively I was also given plans at a very young age because of my great-grandmother. She used to buy these really ridiculous lottery brochure things where you could win like a ugly McMansion in Brisbane somewhere, and like gold bullion in a car or I don't know what. But I didn't really care about any of that. I just thought it was amazing that they had these enormous houses and these things called plans on them. So from that, I used to sit in my bunk bed with my 2 twin brothers below me, trying to draw my dream home. And, you know, well, but mostly just my bedroom. And basically that grew into kind of a real sort of keen spatial curiosity as a child, which I later as a teenager realized was a job. But I never actually knew anybody in the architectural industry, neither did my parents or my extended family, my community. It wasn't a commonly sought after thing. So yeah, it was a bit of a strange one in a lot of ways for me to pursue so early on with such clarity. Definitely going into architecture school was a little bit of a different experience from there, but yeah, no, architecture's sort of more or less been the plan for a long time.
Yeah, I'm like Elisabetta in that I've told this story a few times, that it sort of sounds coherent now when I tell it, but actually there's probably a few different elements weaved into a narrative. So actually, as I said, I grew up in Australia, northern New South Wales, and I often say I grew up in an eco community there, which is partially true. So my parents were founding members and my sister grew up there, but my parents split up when I was barely alive. And so my dad always lived there. And so I was, you know, with him on weekends and holidays and sometimes part-time. But with mum, we moved around a lot. And so we lived in like housing commission housing. We lived in like sheds out in the bush. We lived in like this tiny house that was much too small. And my stepbrother had a caravan in the backyard where he lived. You know, so those kind of things. So we did move quite a lot and live in housing that was not ideal, but my mum always made a real effort to make the home feel like a home. And I never realized that we were poor and that it was just me and mum and she's on a benefit. And my mum always grew a lot of her own food. And I feel like I was protected from a lot of things that I only kind of realized later. But the other component is that, you know, my grandfather took us all home when I was about 11 for the first time, and went to Whangarei and saw that, you know, we're taken to all this land and it's like, oh, it's our land, but I don't understand why our whānau are not living on it anymore. And my pop was talking about his growing up at Toi Toi and, you know, really attached to home, but I'm like, well, it's just pine trees now, so why aren't we there? And I didn't understand why that was. And then we'd go stay with our whānau in kind of substandard housing around town, rented housing, you know, overcrowded, all of that thing. And there's a bit of a disconnect because I couldn't understand, well, here's our land, how come we can't be living on it? Especially when the living memory of living together on that land was only within my grandfather's time. And so that's driven a lot of my work towards reconnection and return. And probably the last one is just, you know, I got the course catalogues out when I was in my second to last year of high school, went through all the courses, thought about what things I might be interested in. And actually my top preference was fine arts animation at Griffith University, but I changed it at the last minute. And my next like 2 preferences were architecture, because I thought, I don't know if I can make a living as a fine arts animator. And so So I chose the more practical option. But I really did genuinely believe at that time and now that if you have the ability to shape the physical environment, then you can create better social outcomes and positively contribute to people's lives. So that was what I think motivated me and what has motivated me to remain in the profession.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to ask you another question that you probably get asked all of the time by way of setting a little bit of context. And I know Carol and Georgia, you've probably talked about this a million times in an Australian context, about what your sort of education content was at university. But I might throw this question to Elizabeth and Jay, just to understand, because we have this conversation all the time, many of us go, okay, we had a week of architectural history on Indigenous architecture, and it was talking about sort of the different structures that maybe people from different parts around Australia made, and that's really it. It never really continued into a contemporary understanding of what Indigenous architecture is, was, or could be. And that really set up a context for almost everyone that came before us who's now practicing, and everyone almost still now who's studying at the moment, to come into the architectural profession with absolutely no idea of what Indigenous architecture could be. And I say could be because we really are in our infancy in Australia. You're a little bit further along than we are. So I'm interested to hear your experience of your education and really what you experienced, and whether you thought it was sufficient, or whether you had any content whatsoever. And I'm sorry, it's another question you probably get asked all the time, but I want to make sure that we have that comparison in this conversation.
Yeah, no, I think it's really valuable. I mean, you sort of get asked it in sort of different ways and different forms, and certain people have various agendas about that question sometimes too. But look, I think, I mean, Jade and I sort of, well, Jade's had a different sort of approach to the education of architecture maybe than I have, being that you started in Brisbane. But for me, I was straight out of high school. So, you know, the big not adult age of 18. I realized you really don't have the capacity to make adult choices at 18. But anyway, so 2006 was my first year at architecture school at the University of Auckland, and 2010 was my last year, the end of the MArch Prof. I'll just be outright and say I really struggled with university. I struggled for a lot of reasons. I felt very, very, very out of place. So in my first year at architecture school, I think was one of two people from West Auckland, which means nothing to you Australians, I suppose, but I don't know, there's a certain kind of stereotype about Westies, I guess. I was one of two Maori and one of two Pacific Islanders. So there was one other Tongan guy in our year. He lasted a semester. And then it was myself and now a very, very good friend of mine, Dokuta Tude, and we were the only two in our year group. I remember looking around distinctively across the 5 years in my first year and not being able to really find more than about 10 Māori and Pacific students across the whole 5-year cohort, so roughly 500 to 600 students. We have systems potentially similar to what you guys might have, as well as the actual papers, what was called the Tuakana program, which is effectively a mentoring type program that's been created effectively because of the university's treaty obligations to supporting Māori, but it also kind of loops in, you know, our other brown friends, aka Pacifica as well. And in my first year, there were 3 Tuakana mentors who were all amazing human beings, and I met them once at the end of the year. That was a sum total of mentorship I had that was, you know, meant to be run by university staff who sort of, depending on which university staff member you got, you know, that the support was neither here nor there sometimes. And then in terms of actual papers, we had a Pacific architecture elective in my 4th year, and 9 of us took that course, and the other 8 people taking it were all immigrants to New Zealand. And I was, by then, by 4th year, really, really angry about that. I couldn't understand why we could live in the Pacific and not learn about the architecture of the Pacific. And I think it was by 4th year that I realized how sort of radicalized my own thinking had become, and how frustrated I had been by the fact that I was largely quite disillusioned by architecture at that point, something that I had spent my entire life very set on doing and being, and you know, thinking it would really help me to help others. At that point, I was really surprised that there wasn't any content really that was directly about anything Māori, anything Pacifica, unless you really went and sought it hard for yourself. There are a couple of amazing lecturers who were in the degree sort of generally. Deirdre Brown, Rewe Thompson kind of came and went. I had Derek Kawati by the time I got to 4th year, but again, as a shy, maybe 1st year student, it was always really tough to get in touch with those sorts of tutors because they were also under really high demand and a lot of pressure, which I now understand as a person in that position being sought out by students. So, sorry, very long-winded way of saying, not fantastic. I don't know how much it's improved exactly, but that's maybe a topic we can expand on. I do, and I know a lot of my colleagues do, try and make a really concerted effort to reach out to university students. And just to touch on it quickly, but there was a study that's been ongoing, and the results of that were published this year for the 2008 to 2018 kind of period of research. And they found that the number of Māori and Pacific students graduating the architecture schools has declined. And so that's a really disheartening thing to know as well, that the general average of students is declining. It actually means that we might end up going backwards in the work that we've done over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, and I'm quite concerned about that personally, and I know a lot of us are as well. So there's quite a bit of conversation at the moment about how to get back into high schools and support those students that go from high school through to university, but it's a really, really big conversation, and it can't just be had by a handful of us. It actually has to be an industry-wide thing, approach. So yeah.
So yeah, my experience was slightly different, but oddly the same. So I also started in 2006, but I didn't finish my master's till 2015. I dropped out like 2-3 times, and I will go through that. But I went to the University of Queensland fresh out of high school. It was quite jarring actually, because thankfully I had some whānau in Brisbane, but they all lived in the outer suburbs like Morayfield and Springfield, where Māori can afford to live. And so I was living right in the inner suburbs, you know, close to university, but my whānau were all quite far away, which was okay, but it had its challenges. It's not like I could just stay with them. It would have been hard to get to school. But when I went to uni, you know, it's a very high cutoff to get in, and a lot of the students were from very fancy schools, mostly in Brisbane. A lot of them were from really affluent backgrounds and still lived at home, which was great for them, but they didn't have the same pressures associated with having to work and look after yourself and try to figure out how to be an adult when you're still a teenager. And, you know, there was no other Māori students or any other Pacifica students. There was no Indigenous students. Most of the students were white or Asian. And I don't know what the demographics look like in the profession or in education now. And I made some good friends, but I did feel it was quite alienating. And most of the people that I was studying with hadn't had the kind of life experiences or background that I had, and also had a different level of support to what I had available to me. And so in my 3rd year, my grandfather got sick and later passed away. So I took a lot of time off. And that meant that I had to drop out of my final design studio because I just had gotten too far behind. So that tacked on part of another year to finish my undergrad. at UQ you needed to do a year out working as a requirement before you could return for your master's, but it was the global financial crisis and none of us could get jobs. I went and worked at a landscaping company as an estimator and did a bunch of random stuff, and they let me come back with that because nobody could get jobs. I remember my most brilliant classmate, who had, straight sevens, high distinctions the whole way, was thinking about getting a job in his mum's friend's wedding shop because he just couldn't find a job in architecture. And that was really disheartening. So I'm like, well, there's no hope for anybody else. And so that happened. And then I went back so something that happened in this period is that on one of my trips home, my auntie Liza suggested that I get in touch with our whanaunga Ro Hoskins, who's a well-known Māori architect. And so she gave me his contact details and I got in touch with him. And he was really supportive and pretty much just encouraged me to come home. And so I tried to do that. I applied to Unitec and they lost my application. And then they said, sorry, the program's full. And then also because I had just moved without any savings, I was running out of money and paying and living with my cousin, and I don't know, I was just broke. Anyway, so I went back to UQ who would have me back, and then I got there and I thought, this isn't where I wanted to be. This isn't the kind of work I wanted to be doing. So I dropped out of my first attempt at masters in 2011, and then I went and worked at a shop called Culture Kings for a while full-time to save up. I also worked at a bar that used to be called the Hi-Fi. It was like a live music venue. So I had like lots of cool jobs that my friends thought were great in my early 20s. Anyway, and so I managed to return in 2012 and I started at Unitec in 2013. And the importance of going to Unitec is that Ro Hoskins and Karen Wilson were both running and still are a studio called Te Hononga, which is a Māori design studio that works with Māori communities on real projects. And, that was just such a huge impact on me to be able to actually do the work that I wanted to be doing and see that it was possible and see that it was happening. Through Ro, I also connected with Ngā Aho, which is our Māori Design Professionals Network. And again, I think that's the reason I've managed to stay in the profession, because what I was faced with in my education is that the reasons that I got into architecture and that I thought was even the reason for architecture and then the purpose and all these social things and cultural things, I wasn't seeing that reflected in the profession, at least not in my education or the professionals that I was being exposed to. And I found that really jarring. I'm like, maybe I don't understand what architecture is for. Maybe I've got the wrong idea because nobody seems to be doing what I think, what I know I want to be doing and what I think architecture is for. And then suddenly I was opened up to this whole group of professionals who had the same worldview as me and the same understanding of what we were doing was about. And so that was hugely reinforcing and continues to be. And so through my experiences at Unitec, I was able to participate in Te Hononga Studio. Ro was has been a really important mentor to me and helped me get connected. The other thing that's really important is that I didn't even know Māori could be professionals. All my family members work as cleaners in warehouses and things. And, whenever I do well academically, it would be like, oh, it must be because of your dad's side, because my dad's Dutch. And I think that's actually so racist. But, that was the attitude. And, Māori can't be professionals or Māori can't be smart. It must be your white side. And so to be exposed to Māori role models who are professionals just generally, let alone in the area that I had been studying, is just, wild, because you go, oh my God, that could actually be me. And then, the social capital that comes with that, like Ro introduced me to so many like important people professionally, which is not what you normally get as a student or a graduate. But we traveled all around the country doing lots of interesting projects together, and I have amazing networks as a result. And before that, it's like how do you even make connections? How do you even get beyond where you're at currently? And the final aspect of that experience is that we do a final year research thesis, and so I was able to have Ro as my supervisor alongside Mike Austin, who's Pākehā, but he was basically out there saying Māori and Pacifica architecture exists back when everyone else was saying it's not even a real thing. Yeah. So that's quite major. And so he's quite elderly now, but his contribution was so significant. So it was a real privilege to be able to learn from him. So yeah.
The Mike Austin thing is super important, and I like to contextualize it because he in 1974 applied to do his PhD on Pacific architecture and was declined by the University of Auckland because Pacifica people, Māori people didn't actually make architecture. We made huts, and so the PhD was declined on that basis. And so I like to to remind people of that fact. That later, 2 years later, it was allowed and he was able to go on and do his PhD eventually. An incredibly important work, and he's a really, really amazing man. But you know, it's great to have had an ally to fight for that, to open the door for the rest of us to come through. But that it's not actually been that long since even the presence of us as having design excellence has even been considered as a part of the canon at all. And that will be the case for you all as well. We were just mucking around in the mud, I think. Yeah.
I wonder, Carol, do you want to pick up on the question that Elisabetta raised about indigenising, or what we call in Australia largely indigenising architectural education, and where that's happening, where we're getting to with that? That's like one of your main roles, I guess, in your work that you do. So I'd love to hear from you what you think the state of play is in that regard at the moment.
Yeah, I guess that, you know, I mean, it's really difficult to have a whole of Australia context for this because there's so many schools, but and where it's occurring is sometimes largely being driven by Indigenous people. And as you know, in Australia, we just don't have the numbers that New Zealand. I always look with absolute envy at the cohorts, not only against, you know, in Maori, but Pacifica people as well, you know, so having, you know, because people have multiple family links across, you know, Aotearoa, but also to other sort of parts of the Pacific. So in Australia, I guess that if I can just give you an idea about UQ, because I guess that's where my level of knowledge is incredibly intimate. But across Australia, there is no sort of you know, national approach to indigenising curriculum. So, and a large reason is not a lack of willingness currently, but I would say when I was a student, there was a lack of interest and a lack of consideration of Indigenous architecture being something that sits within the canon as well, you know. So people within the profession were referring to what Indigenous people built as sticks and twigs architecture. So it wasn't really even seen as something that had any sophisticated level of technological detailing, understanding, and so that's where it essentially sat in that sort of other realm of, you know, Indigenous and it wasn't really considered as part of the canon. And so I think that's been a recent, relatively new and recent thing in Australia, and it's been largely advanced by, you know, researchers and a minority of researchers who are working in that space, but also working internationally with other like-minded researchers, you know, and like Mike Austin, you know, the Mike Austins of the world across, you know, and that's certainly occurred in Australia where the, so taking that seriously now, and that's a very much a 21st century thing. So let's not, you know, you know, researchers or academics or practitioners who are working in that space was sort of seen as niche and really, you know, probably held, you know, not necessarily held up, but seen it as a humanist work, you know. I'm going to work with the Indigenous people rather than actually something that really seriously contributed that Indigenous people, like all peoples in the world, were entitled and had rights to have design spaces that reflected their culture, their identity, and their sort of belief system. So yeah, so I think in terms of the curriculum development, where it is, there's definitely an attempt in universities across Australia to include Indigenous content, but there is definitely a lack of practitioners or academics who actually feel like they have a sufficient knowledge base to be able to teach at a university level. Having said that, there is certainly a lot of literature that people could actually access, and there is content that could include that as a part of the, not necessarily just history and theory teaching courses. I mean, I see sort of, Indigenous architecture being across every aspect of architecture in terms of, the design studios in particular. And through my entire degree, I never did a single design studio that had any Indigenous architectural content. And it was sort of something that occurred haphazardly. And I would say probably at UQ, it's something that's much more, frequent, it's offered, there's multiple studios, there's also staff, multiple non-Indigenous staff who have that capacity to teach and really engage with, Indigenous clients and organisations. And I know that at other universities that there are attempts to do that to varying degrees, but would I say it's sort of something that's systematic as a part of architectural education? No, not at all. I mean, I'd be interested to know, like Georgia, who went to UQ, did you do a studio that had any, Indigenous content in it or focus?
A design studio, no. And similar situation to the girls where the theory subjects towards masters that you could undertake in your masters that had a real focus on Indigenous architecture was a selective. So it wasn't a compulsory thing for everyone to do. And in the bachelor's, from what I recall, there was one or two that were compulsory. But again, I guess sort of just touching on materiality and just form and not really getting deep into narrative or even the cultural and social structure of each country, which really I think are quite critical if you're going to be designing on that country for this particular community. But I wanted to touch back on what Jade was saying, Alyssa was saying about allies. And I think I definitely got that from UQ through people who were teaching there, such as yourself, Carol. I think I met, through yourself and Kelly Greenall, the network sort of grew from there. And then Sarah, I met you down the line, and it's just about continuous growth of banding together to, I guess, I've been learning in that sense, in that way, of educating myself through others, through these allies. But yes, I can't recall having, back in when I started my bachelor's in 2011. I started my bachelor's straight after high school and just kept going. I had a year out in between bachelor's and master's, and sort of finished that back in 2016, my master's. But, that was even quite recent, and I can't recall, like, I don't remember anyone sort of having a real focus on a design studio that was purely about just engaging with country. I don't know if that's changed, Carol, but that was my own personal.
I can say that the Pacifica Architecture course that was an elective when I was there was shifted to being a third year paper that everybody had to take, which is great. I personally think it should start at first year. But also something that struck me in these sort of general wider conversations that I've been having when I joined the board of the NZIA and so our institute and other things like that, is actually that we, between Aotearoa and Australia, probably need to coordinate our response to thinking about the transformative change required in the educational systems, because a lot of the moderation of our programs happens between our two countries. I know there's a bit of a sort of Asia Pacific, whatever that means, kind of conglomerate. But I have been told, I don't know if it was offhandedly, but or if it, you know, if it was an excuse, but that you know, there's general buy-in in Aotearoa for Maori content to be included in the degree, and that happens at various levels in various ways. You can kind of get into the minutiae of how that is good and bad and how that works and doesn't, but that one of the harder things is actually getting it as a part of the, say, moderation criteria, because of the size and weight and voice of the Australian universities. Because, you know, when I was at university, there were basically 3 schools of architecture. You could kind of say now there's 4 or 5, depending on, you know, which part in the degree. So some schools will offer the bachelor's, some are now offering the master's, and then you've still got the 3 that are doing both. So there's a few more options, but we are still a smaller voice in the wider context. But I do believe there needs to be a sort of broader approach that includes both of our countries. And I think that's something that probably these conversations hopefully help change, or help begin change with. So that would be really exciting. And one other thing that struck me in my kind of years of dialogue and this sort of stuff was actually, it was unfortunately at Rewe Thompson's funeral. So very young, like he was only 58, Maori architect who was quite well known here in Aotearoa, who had a really close relationship to Kevin O'Brien. They were in the middle of trying to set up a Trans-Tasman design paper, and it's always frustrated me that nobody's picked that up again, and it's nobody's fault. It's just like, it would be great to do. And you know, I think there's a lot of value we have that that's yet, or potential that's yet to be tapped into in a way, and particularly I think within the Indigenous space, within the design space, and I know we were navigators, we were traveling before contact, we were talking to one another as nations, as countries as well. And you know, I have this like kind of bee in my bonnet about actually wanting to reinstate that as Indigenous people, country to country. And so that's my challenge to us and to whoever ends up watching this thing, you know, and responding. It would be really great to start having some genuine dialogue to change the state of our education as a group, as a collaborative group between countries, and actually to start designing together, teaching our students together. There's a COVID thing at the moment, but later, you know, I don't see why not. You know, there's practical experience we have here. There's practical experience you guys have as well. There's differences that are beautiful. There's tensions that would be amazing to explore. Completely different land context. You know, we do a lot of other things. We're sharing other things. Why not education?
I mean, I can speak probably on behalf of Carol and Georgia in this context. We would love to do a studio with you guys.
Absolutely.
That would be great.
Yeah.
One of our universities should make that happen. I guess I'm just conscious of the time, so I do slightly want to move us on, and I'm going to skip one of the questions that I had, and I'm really interested in taking us to the point of, what are you advocating for now? Like, what do you think now needs to change in the context of where the conversation has changed since your education and entering into the profession? But what is it that you believe now actually has to change? What are the conversations you're passionate about?
I might go first for this one. Something that I'm really passionate about changing in Australia, in the Australian context, is just making this kind of conversation the norm. I think there are a lot of people that are afraid to get it wrong, or afraid to say something wrong, and I think that's holding us back from moving forward. So that's something that I try to advocate for in all my social groups, as well as you know, in the professional atmosphere as well. So that's something that I really am trying to do, just make it a conversation that just allows for growth and change and awesome architecture. Something I also that has stuck with me from last year. Carol and Sarah, I don't know if you remember, from the Paola salon that we had, I think in November, there was an image, and Carol, you've heard me tell this before, but there was an image on a PowerPoint that came up from this lady telling this amazing story about how they had this mentoring program of all females who had been in the industry, and there was like 8 photos of 2 generations of females, one quite older and the one who's literally just fresh and green into the industry. And I want to see that, but with Indigenous females, that exact same slideshow with more photos. So that's what I'm trying to advocate for, just those 2 things, and as much as I can, but they're probably the strongest ones.
Yeah, so I think, you know, definitely take George's cue there in raising that. But I think the other thing is that I've lived to see, it sounds like I'm 150, sorry. I've lived to see, I'm actually not. I just sound like it. To see the Australian Institute of Architects including that as a part of the national competency standard, you know, that having Indigenous knowledge and also in terms of engagement with, you know, as practitioners, respect towards, you know, Indigenous, you know, countries across the nation. So that's been incredible shift and change, you know, from having 0 content or limited content with, you know, 1 practitioner in all of Australia teaching, or 1 or 2 practitioners actually delivering Indigenous content, to now, you know, the Institute, the chapters, architectural events, you know, things like BLAKitecture. It feels like, and it seems like, and I think it's quite deceptive. It feels like, oh, you know, there's Indigenous content everywhere. It's so exciting. You know, we're finally at that space. But I don't think we're at that space until we actually have the realisation that George is talking about, where we see Indigenous graduates really participating at high levels in architecture and being able to transform and change architecture so that it becomes a part of the norm, and it's not a fringe discussion, it's not a fringe event, and then it's not also an opportunity for practitioners to see, oh, this is another economic opportunity for our practice. This is actually really core and part of the way in which they do business, because they're really interested in engaging with you know, Indigenous people in a genuine way, because that rather than for what the, you know, economic opportunity that it presents, which I think is pretty much sometimes the motivation of some practitioners. They just see that this is opening up across institutional spaces, and hence you have to have knowledge, and so we're going to upskill in that, because then it becomes another sort of strong business case for the expansion of our business. So and I think that will have a short run with communities, you know, and Elizabeth was talking about earlier, you know, about governance, and Jade, about governance structures, you know, really being, you know, you don't see transformation unless it's sort of through every tier, you know, and engagement. And so unless there are engagement structures that actually really include Indigenous people in a meaningful way, then, you know, I work in an institutional space that, and at an institution that's, you know, starting to develop Indigenous design guidelines, and they want to do it in a way that is not, you know, adding an Indigenous layer to space, but actually do it in a way that it's transformative for Indigenous people in an economic sense, but also spatially, contextually, but also in a governance, you know, processes. And so it's a new form of business as usual, rather than the old form. So I think that's the thing that I'm getting most excited about, and seeing that occurring across different institutional spaces, to down to practice. Like, I'm so inspired with what Sarah does with the practice that she works with, to see sort of people like Georgia, and also engage with, you know, young Indigenous people who are really super excited about engaging in this in a future that has great impact and transformation potential for the way that Australia practices and engages with Indigenous values and in space and place.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
So the thing that I'm really, well, there's so many things, but the thing I want to focus on is just the growth of kaupapa Māori practices. We don't have very many, and most of our practitioners, they're either, you know, solo architects or designers, or they get snapped up by their iwi and go work in resource management or governance or management or something. Or they're working in mainstream practices, sometimes doing Māori oriented work, sometimes not. And we just have so few Māori practices, and so few of the ones that do exist have any appetite for growth. And we really do need some slightly larger, you know, I think some medium scale firms out there, and we need them all around the country. There's huge gaps. I mean, in terms of my personal ethics, I often, you know, would question getting asked to work in areas that I don't have whakapapa or genealogical links to. But sometimes there's actually nobody who is from there who has the right skills and training and the ability to take on the project. And to me, that's a problem. I shouldn't be the go-to for an iwi I'm not from, but I'll support it if there's nobody else available. But my next port of call would be to try to bring on board graduates or you know, younger practitioners who are able to step into that space with my support. So that's kind of the goal of the vehicle that I've been building. But we need more. There's not nearly enough, and it's a problem. And we do see some of the same issues around, you know, mainstream firms become more interested in Māori work, sometimes very genuinely, sometimes as a competitive advantage because they see that there is settlement money. So maybe sometimes it's a bit of a mixture of both. But I do think that if you are working in that space, especially doing explicitly Māori work, then really you have a commitment to advance it. You should have a commitment to advancing Māori practitioners and growing them so that that generation coming through are equipped to do that work in future. And so that's what I'd love to see from our mainstream practices, and that's something that Elisabetta is very involved with within her practice. But I also think we need to see our Māori practices growing. And we also have a huge push for Indigenous procurement at the moment. And a lot of it is concentrated in construction, general contractors, trades, that kind of thing. There's no reason it can't be also architecture and planning and you know, the other built environment professions, although we're not seeing it yet. At the moment, when we do government tenders, usually, you know, it's only the bigger firms that can be competitive because you need to have a certain track record and experience on certain kinds of projects and so on. And so we end up in a situation, and I still don't really know what to do about this, but where we've got the big firms and then we get our little Māori practitioners on the side teaming up with them, and then we inadvertently end up in competition, which is, as Māori practitioners, that's, well, no, actually, no, I can't say everyone has this view. I know some are quite into competition. I'm really not. I'd rather be collaborative. If I'm not the right person for the job, I'd like to step aside and support the person that is, or work together and not step aside and, you know, be in a collaborative way. And I really think that's how we should be working. But sometimes these processes are set up that create a competitive environment without us even knowing, and limit our ability to support one another. And I've often thought about, what if our little practices started teaming up and going for these big government bids? But the reality is most of us don't have the track record or the scale to, you know, to demonstrate that we can meet their base criteria to even get a look in. So I don't think it's an easy fix. And I think part of it is actually getting some of our practices to, you know, grow a bit more and be a bit more competitive in that space. Yeah, so lots of challenges. We still have really low numbers in our profession, although it's higher than what I hear you have over there. It's still kind of astonishingly low. Like, I think maybe it's like less than 2% of registered architects are Māori.
I can give you the actual number if you'd like.
Thanks, I would love it. Yeah.
It's actually 3%.
Oh, okay.
So like fractionally higher, but yeah. not a lot.
You know who I was citing? Someone told me the other day it was 3% for Maori and Pacifica, so I was just shaving a bit off, but they must have quoted.
No, so there's 65 registered architects who identify as Maori. There's 8 that identify as Samoan, like 2 Tongan. Oh, hold on, here's the actual number. 8 Samoan, 8 Cook Island, 3 Niue, and 2 Tongan. So, small but mighty.
Yeah.
Last time I looked at the statistics here, or the last census, whenever that was, 2014 or 2016, I think we represented about 0.03% of the architectural profession.
Yeah.
And in order for us to have population parity, we would need to have 333 registered practicing Indigenous architects, and we're quite a way off that. But it's something to strive for. I think that I've loved all of these conversations, and I do have sort of at least one more question to ask you. But reflecting on this, I was actually, if I may put my 2 cents into this conversation, I was asked to do a diagram for work the other day about what our Indigenous advisory space actually means. So my role in my practice is both architecture and ideally working on projects that work with communities so that we can embed those values and knowledge into our projects. But then also working with governments and competition processes and other architectural practices to advise them or to undertake traditional owner engagement on their behalf for other projects, so that in the sort of greater good theory that if we can work with as many practices as possible, then this becomes normalised and more projects will work like this. And one of my colleagues asked me to create a diagram about sort of not what is our Indigenous advisory space, but why. And so I sat down for a while and I thought, okay, well, every project in Australia is built on, like 100% of projects built in Australia are on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. And that means that every project has the capacity to be an act of destruction, an act of maintenance, an act of repair, or an act of celebration. And at the very minimum, we need to start with maintenance in the definition that it would be do no more harm. And what we really need to be doing is looking at celebration, which is genuinely designing with value in community, culture, country, values and knowledge systems of our traditional owners, whatever they may be, in whatever place that may be. And ultimately what that, at least to me, means that we need to be designing with country rather than against it. And I feel like we're a really long way away from that, but there are sort of glimmers of hope of examples that are coming through of what that actually means. But then also, like, we exist in this world of architecture where we're at university and we're sort of taught a certain way of thinking about architecture, and it's very much object-based or it's very much theory-based. And you never really go back to the concept of, okay, well, the central question is, what is country and what does that mean for this place and what are the values of country, at least in an Australian context, and how do we make sure that we're working with country, and the fact that that's going to be different everywhere. Like we have such a long way to go, but also there's so many exciting things happening that it really motivates me to keep working. And I guess if I can keep adding my 2 cents, what I'm advocating for is that there needs to be change across every part of our profession. It needs to be encouraging more students to come into education of architectural, the built environment. We need to almost de-silo these things so that we start having conversations across these professions. We need to make sure that any Indigenous people that go into education systems don't feel like they have to leave their culture at the door. And actually that's something that they can bring with them, and that's something that their tutors are actually adequately equipped to critically evaluate and respond to. And that there are Indigenous people in these roles, and of course we need more of them, that students can see themselves reflected in. Then our profession obviously needs to change in that it understands what it actually means to centre country in design, and that doesn't have to be something that is only exclusive to traditional owner engagement. There needs to be a baseline understanding that every project we do, even if we can't understand what the knowledge is, we can still understand what the country is. And that we can embed that in our design, so that even where we might not be able to engage with traditional owners, we can still work from a place of doing no more harm and even better repair, even better celebration. And And then, you know, even the way that we talk about architecture in the media has to change. And we need to make sure that where projects have had engagement with traditional owners, that they actually included those voices of those traditional owners. Our awards processes, Elizabeth and Carol, we've talked about this at length, but our awards processes need to change so that those voices are centered, so that the engagement process is actually part of that. And wherever these projects are talked about in the media, they have to change so that we as Indigenous practitioners, every time I open a magazine or a journal and I read something, I look at it and I go, okay, this project is representing someone's totem or someone's Maori or someone's country, but nobody is talking about what the engagement process is. I don't know who the traditional owners, that if they're engaged in this process, if they thought it was appropriate, if they think the outcome is appropriate. And how can I judge this as an appropriate piece of architecture or a good piece of architecture if I don't first know if it's appropriate? So there's just so many things, but everybody's working, and everyone in this Zoom room, shall we call it, and sort of everybody across the profession, in all the different silos that exist, is working on so many different angles to approach this problem. And that's what motivates me to keep going, because it's not just, I don't feel alone. And I know when I was a student, I felt alone, because there was no Indigenous students in my degree, and I didn't know any Indigenous people in architecture until I was in my third year. And they weren't even people studying, they were sort of people that were graduates or had done something. I think I met Carol for the first time at the end of my third year. And that to me was like, what? There are these people that I should know? How is this not normal? Anyway, I'll stop talking. I think my last question, because we're getting close to our hour of time, but it's okay if we go a little bit over. I just want to ask, what is it that you're most proud of? What is something that you've done that really gives you pride and keeps you going?
I guess because I sort of didn't answer the last question, but it links to this next question. So I'll start a little bit with the story, and I'll try not to be too long. I got to spend last weekend with our kaumātua, one of our elders from Ngā Aho, Matua Hari Williams, who you would have met, Sarah, Jade knows very well, who's in his 80s. He's a good vintage. And I got there a little bit late, a little bit hungover, definitely had lost my voice. And the first question he asked after telling me that I was late, and I had missed the karakia, the prayer, was that we were going to go around the table. There were literally 4 of us at the table. We were going to go around the table, and we had to tell each other the story of our names and our life purpose. This was at 12:30 on a Saturday, and I was like, what am I in for? But I have had this conversation once before, and I was surprised at how easy it came to me. I feel like it's one of the life purposes I might have, but so very simply for me, and it sounds really vague and big, but a long time ago, I kind of had this realization that my life purpose was to birth new spaces that were of this whenua, of this land, of this people, that were about empowerment and joy and celebration, and not about with an ability to acknowledge tension and pain and trauma, but to look through that. And it's a big ask of myself, but I'm not one to shy away from the intensity of my own thoughts. And so that's what's been kind of low-key, high-key, the thing that that underpins what I do. And I have been very fortunate in the sort of short period of time, in some ways, although it feels like, a couple thousand years worth of work, to have had some really awesome wins, I feel like. And actually a few of them have popped up lately. I was asked to go to a cover circle with mostly Tongans, but a lot of the current Pacifica group of students at the University of Auckland who were all finishing their master's degree. There's a whole heap of them. And I get invited along, and there was actually me, a newer generation of graduate Pacific Island students, and then this current set of actual students, and I was getting called auntie. And yeah, they were being incredibly rude. No, I'm joking. But actually what it was an acknowledgement of, I suppose, pathways that we're creating for these younger ones. And, you know, they're talking to me about stuff that they had seen me do that I was completely unconscious that they had seen me do. And that, quite frankly, I sat there and was kind of like trying to hold back tears, even though they were like gently mocking me, because it was just beautiful to see, finally start to see layers of students past me, and I didn't think that would come. And it's not about me, it's actually about a whole sort of series of generations of hard work of a lot of people that have put in the time to show up for these students so that they graduate. It's being able to have conversations with an 80-plus-year-old kaumātua about the new strategic direction for our institute that is completely fundamentally trying to change the way every architect has to operate in this country. Like, we're not asking small things of ourselves. It's the fact that the other day we were having a conversation in our office genuinely, because our new strategic plan for our practice is to be a bicultural practice, and a lot of people are nervous about that. They don't know what that means, but they're trying. And I said, quite frankly, that bicultural practice, being a bicultural practice that acknowledges Māori and non-Māori within Aotearoa, yes, we're going to have all the beautiful fluffy stuff, the good-looking buildings, the great narratives, the excellent process. You know, we're going to lean in really hard to this stuff. But in order to get there, we're going to keep coming across systemic issues. We're going to come across the issues with our oranga tamariki, you know, our ministerial, you know, parts of our government, education, health, whatever, that have fundamentally wronged Indigenous people and are still doing it. You know, highest incarceration rate of Indigenous women in the world is Māori women. So in order for us to do the fluffy stuff, actually as architects, we need to do more dirty work in terms of the politics and the government and the really hard conversations. And I've been pushing very hard for a lot of non-Māori to lean harder into these spaces, because they get too many opportunities to opt out, and they've had too many generational opportunities to opt out, and I'm over it. So, you know, that I'm able to have this conversation and it's taken seriously, it's a win. Now, when we start actioning it, that's when I'll start dancing, because, like, that's a real big shift, I think, personally. And yep, it's really hard. We are one of those big practices that can demonstrate track record with government departments, but it also doesn't mean that we necessarily got the track record to change things systemically, because we are still trained as architects. But I actually think the genius of us as Indigenous people, and if I may say us as Indigenous women in the Zoom room, is actually that we are not fundamentally just trained in architecture. We are fundamentally trained as our people within this collective knowledge group, which means I think we have better qualifications for dealing with these problems, which is actually why we're all in these really tough positions. You know, but I think we do it really well. So there's these burdens that we have to unpack, and that's one of the things that I think, you know, is probably just going to be the reality of our generation and a few generations after us, and definitely the generations before us. But it's really lovely to see some of the younger ones coming through, realizing that there are already some things that have been untangled for them, and some barriers, not always all of them, and only in a little way, that have been kind of pulled down. You know, it's all a bit muddy sometimes, but there have been little moments, I'd say, glimmers, you know, lights at the end of the tunnel or whatever lately, that have showed me that it's worth it, and we're going to keep pushing. So yeah. That's my thing.
I might jump back in then and answer the question. You know, I always love being on things with you and some of our other friends, I think you can guess who, because you get to tag team, and I think even though we are aligned and have the same values, we bring different elements to the conversation. So I always really value that, and the value of being in the space together as Indigenous women. It's so different when you're the one lone voice, and there's so much strength in being able to come together like this. So reflecting on that question of what are you most proud of, so it's still a work in progress, but I've been working on 2 papa kāinga for my whānau and whāngarei. And to me, you know, reoccupying our ancestral kāinga and getting back on our land,
Explain
I think
papa
it's the
kāinga.
most, sorry, yeah, let me try to do that. So it's like our village, but our ancestral village. Papa kāinga is more often the way it's been brought back in contemporary times. There's very few, there are some, but there are very few kāinga that have maintained that kind of continuous occupation all the way through in a similar manner, although there are definitely some. So for most of it, it's been interrupted in some way. So papa kāinga really denotes that relationship with Papa Tuanuku, which is our ancestral earth mother, and demonstrates that our ongoing connection sustained through time and connected through our genealogy. And so getting back onto our papa kāinga to me is a really one of the most, you know, radically decolonial things that we can do. So we have 5% of Māori land left out of what used to be 100. And we have a very urbanized population, so we were encouraged to migrate to the cities, and sometimes there was not much of an option given so much of the land had been taken and a variety of other things. And so we have a largely urban Māori population, and the majority of us live outside our ancestral rohe. So to be able to return not only to where we're from, but to reoccupy the land that was occupied by our tupuna, fulfill our responsibilities as kaitiaki or guardians of that place, as well as to be able to strengthen and maintain our language and culture, as well as the really important economic and political organizing element of being in the kāinga. All of those things are really critical. And so in terms of what I'm proud of is that we're on a journey as a whānau, and I've been leading these projects and being able to do the architectural work to develop them. And so when they are eventually built, so we're progressing, when they are built, that'll be the most important thing I've ever done. And even if I do nothing else, not that I'm saying I'm, you know, quitting anything, and I know I'll do many other things in my lifetime, but I could honestly say hand on heart, if I did nothing else but got our kāinga back up and running, then I would have really achieved something important in my life. And so it might remain my top achievement even when I do lots of other stuff.
I feel like I'm so early on in my career that I'm proud of like everything that I've sort of done so far in a way, but I still know that there's so much to come forward. So with that in mind, and like acknowledging that I'm only just sort of starting to take these big strides in my career, it's more, I guess, I'm proud of just being a part of this conversation and allowing myself to be vulnerable and make mistakes in tensioned areas and have those tense conversations, and then being able to share that experience with others to continue that conversation, but also let them know experiences and how to sort of tackle particular situations in, I guess, design, schematic and construction documentation form, like all of that stuff. So I guess that's what I'm most proud of, is just being able to have these conversations and continue that.
Sarah, so I just, you know, I'm thinking about that question about being proud, you know, and I guess that similarly, I think, you know, having to be in this moment and to see this moment rather than as an individual accomplishment, the collective, to see the collective sort of energy and diversity of Indigenous voices that is occurring within Australia, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices. And, you know, despite the fact that there are very low numbers on the ground, that the conversation is occurring, and that we're using every available resource to sort of keep in that conversation, to keep shifting and changing things, and it's occurring across governance structures and institutional spaces. So I think that, to me, it's not so much an individual accomplishment, but to be a part of that sort of collective, you know, voice that is occurring, and to see younger people coming through universities, who are engaging in the space and have something to engage with. You know, where I went, as I mentioned, I went to university with the objective that thinking idealistically that design would solve all the problems, and that there were the mechanisms and structures that would engage and invite that sort of change in conversation. And disappointingly, you know, I still find that Indigenous housing, my whole sole objective hasn't really shifted dramatically in the way that I imagined it would with Indigenous input, and so there's still, you know, there are still lots of things that have to occur across a whole range of structures for real and meaningful change. And I don't think it's something that can be solely done just by Indigenous people constantly sort of using our own agency and projecting into the spaces that are controlled by others. You know, I think really, as Olivia Peter mentioned, it's about allies, really looking for those allies, and it should be something that is the remit of every practitioner who's operating in the space, and rather than, because it's not going to be something that is going to be achieved by a small group, although, you know, there is the myth of, you know, one voice changes everything, you know, it doesn't really. We like to think that, but in reality we need a whole range of the collectivity of you know, everyone participating in that and really joining with allies, you know, to create that. So I think it's, and it's nice to look on the horizon and see that there are sort of winds of change, and it's occurring in really quite meaningful ways, and not just in sort of piecemeal sort of platitudes. So I think that, you know, it's great to be at this point, and I, you know, I keep saying, I think I said a few years ago that we're at the beginning, but I think I'll keep saying that we're at the beginning still, and we've got a long way to go, and I'd like to see, you know, what other things come on the horizon, and so there's been sort of some really nice positive changes, and yeah, so there's more to come.
Thank you all so much for joining us for this yarn. And I just wanted, if anybody wants to say anything before I wrap up, I'll give you 3 seconds and I'll count down to unmute yourself. And it's like Carol and I were teaching this year, and I'd go, anybody? 3, 2, 1.
I would just say, I'm going to say one thing. Thank you, Sarah, for hosting this.
Oh.
And for all the work that you are doing in these spaces. But I think probably I can hazard a guess that we're all doing it, and I genuinely hope for some really restful periods of time coming up for all of us, because I think something people might understand or know generally, but maybe not specifically or in any detailed way, this group of women and every other Indigenous person in this industry will be working double time relative to their colleagues to make sure these conversations are happening. So I just wanted to acknowledge you, Sarah, because I think in this space, you know, you're holding a lot for us, and I always love saying yes to the things that you ask for, because they're always worthwhile, you know, they're always like really wonderful conversations. So that is my final thing, is to say thank you to you, and thank you to you all for this awesome yarn.
I agree. Thank you, Sarah, and girl power.
Oh, and also, if we want to do Indigenous mentoring, you know, it might be easier to do it with a few more countries involved, because there's not many here, there's not many there, there's not many in Turtle Island either. So, you know, like that's another thing we can set up. That can be your thing, Georgia. You know, you can do that.
All right. We'll just create another Deadly Juraman, but across the nation. We started a group recently called Deadly Juraman for Indigenous women, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in the built environment, because we needed a space to have these conversations. And if anybody listening is of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent and is a woman who would like to be part of our group, get in.
And it's really lovely to see what's going on around the nation. So, you know, you meet through that one page, I met so many other women who I didn't know were out there. And that's, I guess, what we're talking about. One, allies, and the secondly, as a collective, we need to move forward together. And
absolutely,
you know, if you are looking to join that group, please do.
But seriously, we started with, like, I knew maybe 8 people when we started that group, and we've now got 21. Like, it's amazing. Yeah.
Excellent. That's awesome.
We might all hang on the line after this and have a bit of a yarn, but I thought I would just thank you all formally for joining us for this yarn. And I really appreciate how open and vulnerable you've all been and shared your stories. And I know that some of these questions you get asked a lot of the time, but I thank you for taking the time to answer them again in the context of this conversation. I feel like sometimes it's useful to have those yarns. And I look forward to us all working together at some point, because we could change the world. Let's do that.
Sounds like a plan.